And joining us now, Janet Ecker, former Finance Minister for Ontario, now President of the Toronto Financial Services Alliance. And welcome back to TVO, Janet.
Pleased to be
Always
here.
good to see you again. We're going to split our discussion in two. We want to talk about the financial aspects, a bit of Bay Street, and then we're going to talk about, if you were sitting around the cabinet table today, a bit of politics. So let's start on the street. Are Canadian banks, in your view, healthy enough to withstand this financial crisis?
I think we are healthy enough in Canada. We're very lucky with our financial system. It doesn't mean that they're not feeling the economic turmoil, but I think Canadians are seeing two things, actually three things. They're seeing that the culture of Canadian banks, Canadian financial institutions, which people love to criticize as being too conservative or too stodgy, there's a good reason why you want your bank to be conservative.
Coming in handy right now,
Very
isn't it?
handy. So I think that's one thing. Secondly, the business model, the way that our banks here in Canada do business, is a much broader base, if I can simplify it, and so it gives them a little more stability when things start to turn against them. And the third thing is the regulatory structure. I mean, the accountability and the regulations that basically say our banks need to have capital reserves sitting there in case there's a problem. So we're not immune, but we're in a very, very strong situation, and I think you're seeing a lot of the strength of our financial services sector here in Canada.
All of that having been said, our banks, internationally speaking, are relatively small. And not only that, our economy is, of course, tremendously dependent on the United States, which, as we know, is going through hell right now. So does that give you pause with the checklist you just gave us?
Well, there's no question. I mean, they, like every business and every family in Ontario, are starting to feel the effects. I mean, if you're in the manufacturing sector, it's your job. If you've got a mutual fund, retirement, pension fund, you're starting to see impacts there. And the banks are not immune from that. But the good news for Canadians is that both the banks and I think the Canadian economy largely have got some good foundations that will help us survive this better than other countries and other jurisdictions are. So it doesn't mean that we should say, happy days are here, because they're not, but it does mean that the foundations that have been built, I think both economically, regulatory and business model with our banks, I think should get us through this, but it's a difficult time for people, because the word you hear a lot of is unprecedented. Never seen this before, don't know where this is going, been in the biz 30 years, and this is new. You hear a lot of that, and I think for people who are not economists or not financial experts, when they hear people with that kind of background making those kind of comments, and just coming up here, I was hearing one of our bank economists talking about this mess. And usually people in financial services like to do versions of, the fundamentals are strong, right? And so, yeah, it's rattling people and they're concerned. But I think that being said, running around panicking isn't going to help us either.
No, having said that, I talked to an economist yesterday who said in 1,000 years they will be studying in schools what we're going through right now, because it is that extraordinary. It is that extraordinary moment in financial history. Let me talk to you a bit about Bay Street and Wall Street. Of course, Wall Street stopped short selling, this practice where you bet on companies to fail and that's how you make money, which sounds perverted, but actually there was a lot of that going on. The Ontario Securities Commission blocked short selling until today. Was this a good move?
Well, I think what they're trying to do is just put all of the regulators and governments, and you could see with the central bank's move today on interest rates, what they're trying to do is just put some floors, some stability within the system, so that everybody gets an opportunity to kind of take a breath, step back and say, whew, what was that? And where do we go now? So I'll let the folks on the street argue about whether short selling is good or bad. There's a view on that, depending on which side of the fence you're on, or whether you're on the receiving end of it or not. But I think the regulators have been very good at trying to think of things that will promote stability. Now, unfortunately, it's not working the way we all want it to work, but I think you're seeing a lot of really good folks doing a lot of coordination, communication. I mean, I think, again, the central banks today, that's not something you've normally seen in the past. I mean, you
the way they work together like that.
That's right. And you even had the Bank of China, who was part of that. So I think the good news out of this is that it's promoting the kind of global conversations amongst central banks, regulators, and our political leaders. You could see Minister Flaherty again today talking about more meetings of the G7 ministers, and I suspect they've probably been glued to each other on the phone almost on an hourly basis. And that's the good news about it.
On that short selling stuff, though, I don't know if you watched much of the testimony from Washington. Mr. Fuld, who came before the guy who ran Lehman Brothers into the ground, some would say, but he was saying naked short selling crushed my company. It basically was the explanation for why this 150-year-old financial institution died in a matter of days. Do you think he's right about that?
Well, there's going to be a lot of sort of picking over the corpse, if I can put it that way.
It is a corpse.
It is a corpse to figure out what really happened. Well, you know, why did this go? Because some banks that have been there for, and institutions have been there for years. You know, things happen very, very, very quickly. I don't think you can say there's one answer. Because you've looked at the model in the United States and the banks. I mean, they didn't have the cushion of retail deposits. They were more leveraged, had more debt than Canadian banks. They were also doing more of what they some people call it subprime mortgages, which some people have probably read and heard more about subprime mortgages than they ever have before in their life, or what was euphemistically known as ninja lending: no income, no jobs, no assets. Want a mortgage? Here. And that kind of thing wasn't happening in Canada, or if it was a very, very, you know, minor piece of the financial institutions. And so that even what we call subprime in Canada is still people with credit ratings, people with documentation, property where, you know,
they had to put something down.
They still had to put something down. And so it was a very different business climate here. And again, I think we're seeing, in the long run, we're seeing the wisdom of that approach.
Okay. Are banks lending money to one another here?
It's getting difficult for them, and you're seeing that. And because the problem is that the whole system depends on confidence. And for example, if I give you $10 for a product, you accept that $10 because of the confidence you have that that $10 is worth something, that it means something. There's accountability, openness, transparency. And because of what's happened with so many of the banks, where all of a sudden, again, you know, someone that's been there for 150 years is all of a sudden not there anymore. So that's causing banks to be very conservative on their lending to each other. The system here in Canada is still working, but it's tighter than it was. And
are businesses and individuals finding it harder to raise capital?
Yes, they are. It is. I mean, it costs more for the banks to lend. It costs more to lend out to consumers and businesses. The Bank of Canada is trying very hard to, as all central banks are, is to keep money in the system, to keep the blood flow, if you will, the circulatory system of our financial system flowing. But it's getting tougher to do because confidence is down, trust is down, the cost of doing it is up. And so it's a very difficult time.
The head of the IMF said that lending to businesses in Canada has flatlined since Bear Stearns collapsed way back in March. Have you started to see in your travels in the financial community fear in the streets? Do you want to put it that way?
It depends who you talk to, but there's certainly uncertainty, concern. You know, as I said earlier, words like unprecedented, historical, never seen anything like this. So people are very concerned. I think, though, the good news, again, is that we've got people who are trying to work out some of the problems within our system so that Canada doesn't have to face what we've seen in the United States and what we've seen in Europe happening.
The investment bank has disappeared in the United States.
Yes.
What impact do you think that's going to have on our banks up here?
Well, first of all, we have a different business model because most of them have been backed up, owned by part of banks with, for example, retail deposits, and which has given them a strength to withstand circumstances like this. There are those that are saying that once the dust settles, that some of our banks here in Canada may have opportunities to acquire assets in other countries that are consistent with their business strategies, and you've seen some of our banks start to explore that. So there may be opportunities for our banks here, but I think at the same time they're being cautious about it, as they probably should be, to make sure that their bottom line is protecting their company, their assets, depositors' assets. You know, the retail Mr. and Mrs. Front Porch out there with their money in a bank, that's important, and I think you've seen that the banks here have been conservative in their approach to protecting that.
Okay, that's the street. That's the financial side of things. I want to take you over to the political side of things, where you spent so many years, formerly as a cabinet minister in the Harris and Eves governments. As a representative of the financial services industry right now, and I'm going to invite you to do something that I know you hate to do, and that is not give a very partisan answer here, okay? Take off your partisan hat for a second.
I've never been known to make
no, never, I know, never. How satisfied are you with the response of both the provincial and federal governments to what's going on here? The financial people have one response, the political people have another response. How have the political people been doing?
Well, I think both Minister Duncan and Minister Flaherty, the Premier and the Prime Minister, have been trying to hit that right balance between saying that things are okay without sounding like they're whistling past the graveyard. And I think that they've largely got that balance correct. It's difficult to do, and you'll hear people, saying that the opposition, of course, is criticizing them, that they should be having meetings, doing things. I've often said there's nothing more alarming than a government determined to do something, but I think they're keeping their cool, and I think that's been a good thing.
You think both of them are?
Yeah, I think so.
Both levels?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And there's been a lot of communication back and forth, sharing information to make sure that actions are coordinated. So,
is that hard to do in the middle of an election campaign?
It's very hard to do. I mean, I think the concern that we've got is that in an environment like this, and again, we'll see what happens with the election results, but right now what I think Ottawa needs certainly is some stability in the government, a government that is able to take some thoughtful action, be considered in its approach if further steps are needed. And I think that
it sounds like a commercial for the Conservatives. We're not going to
do
that
no,
right now.
I'm just saying whoever's there. I mean, obviously I have a preference, but I think whoever's there, I think one of the concerns right now is people's anxiety gets higher. There's a temptation to want to have politicians do something and be seen to do something. And when I would argue too that, I mean, there have been steps taken both provincially and federally to try and ease the situation.
Okay, take us back to a situation when you were in government. A crisis hits. I mean, you guys had the blackout when you were in government. All the lights went out.
SARS. And
you had SARS.
SARS, yeah.
Exactly. Any number of different things.
We had 9/11.
Yes,
actually,
you did.
Jim Flaherty was actually the finance minister when we
for
had
Ontario.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so your government obviously has had to deal with unanticipated, crises, catastrophes along the way. How easy is it to essentially put the normal running of government on hold while everybody focuses attention on the crisis at hand?
Well, actually, in many ways, it's easy to put the government on hold because people in politics tend to be adrenaline junkies, and they tend to have to deal with the media on a daily or hourly basis who are also adrenaline junkies. So one of the problems that you can run into is that you get too fixated on the crisis at hand and forget that there are other things you still have to pay attention to, that the trains still need to run on time. So that's one problem that you need to pay attention to, that you don't forget the basics while you're trying to deal with the crisis. The other issue about the crisis, though, is that you've got to hit that balance between having people see that you get it, you understand, you care, you know what they're going through, but at the same time not play to the crowd, if you will, and stand up and do what you've seen some. I mean, some of the debate in the United States has been not helpful, I think, in terms of...
It's a sweet way to put it.
Yes, yeah.
Pathetic is another way to put it.
Yeah, and that doesn't help either, where, we should ban this, ban that, throw that guy in jail. I mean, there's been a lot of uninformed comment because they're playing to a crowd of people that are, constituents who are quite rightly very, very, very concerned. So getting that balance right is not easy.
What happens around the cabinet table when the Premier calls everybody together and says, here's the crisis we got to deal with? Do people, I mean, I'm wondering what the mood is like around there, Well,
it can depend. I mean, you'll get people around the cabinet table who just stay out of it because either they don't have a perspective or background to contribute, or their ministry isn't part of it. You'll get those that might be jockeying or positioning for future things that might see this as a way.
So even that happens in these moments.
No, it has, and again, most people tend to be. There are political crises, and then there are crises like SARS, or where there. People's lives are important, are there in the balance, if you will. And usually what happens is you get a small group of people, both elected officials, civil servants, and political officials, maybe some outside experts. What a party leader, premier, prime minister will often do in a situation like that is you have like a little tactical team that tries to make sure that they're thinking of everything that needs to be done. The other important piece is the communication, not only to the public about what's going on and trying to get that balance, so you're telling them things when they need to hear it, being able to say with credibility what you know and what you don't know. And one of the challenges that governments have, and you could see this actually with the federal government now, is that people tend to believe a government when they stand up and say, we have a problem. When a politician stands there and says, no, it's okay, we took an action on that, or that's been solved, or whatever, people get very, very skeptical of governments on that. So if
Did you tell Mr. Harper that?
Well, I haven't told Mr. Harper that, but so that's a challenge for whether you're Prime Minister Harper or Premier McGuinty, trying to ease people's concerns. can be difficult when people aren't prepared to believe you.
And let me ask a tangent on that. Let's say you're a senior cabinet minister with a very, an agenda you are really passionate to get through, or you're a premier with an issue that you absolutely wanted to get through, and then this happens.
That's right. Yeah.
And suddenly this, you haven't got any time for, you can't deal with
That's
this because you got to deal with this.
That's right.
How do first ministers or senior ministers respond when that happens?
Well, it's sometimes not a fun thing, and again, it depends on what that issue is. I mean, if it was a really important policy initiative, if it was something that you'd promised, your government or your party had promised, you're not going to be able to get it delivered. It is frustrating, but at the same time, you're elected to deal with things that come forward. And we've also seen governments that have tried to say, I'm going to keep, I'm going to stick to my agenda, when there's another issue there that is taking up people's attention or focusing their minds. It's a problem you need to fix. For example, I mean, this is a much smaller issue, but when I was the social services minister, we had some serious problems in our child welfare system. We had some children that had been abused, killed, inquests. It was very sad. That was nowhere on the very aggressive and ambitious agenda that Premier Harris had in the Common Sense Revolution. But it was an issue we had to deal with, and we did. So you have to make that judgment call and get the balance right.
Last 20 seconds. You want to give some advice to those who are having to deal with this right now at the political level?
I think they're doing fairly well. I don't think they need advice from me. I think both Finance Minister Duncan, Finance Minister Flaherty, and our two leaders in Ontario and Canada, they've got a lot of very smart people who are giving them good advice. The only thing I would say is to take the words off the front cover of the good old Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, an infamous science fiction movie. It says, "Don't panic." And I think right now one of the key things they're working very hard to do is to make sure people are focused and that we can kind of keep control of everybody's anxiety.
Janet, that's the most nonpartisan I've ever seen you. Congratulations.
Well, this isn't a time for partisanship, actually,
there
to
you
be
go.
quite frank.
Janet Ecker, the former Finance Minister of Ontario. Thanks a lot.